this morning. Hello to The Hague. It is Anne here in New York City in a Starbucks so that you don't have to be disturbed by my soon to be, maybe not that soon to be waking, but waking children. It's that time of year, so I have a large iced coffee today. And we do have a couple of questions, so we can get started. So today's questions are, we have one question. Our son has been making very high-pitched screeching noises throughout the day for the last 3 weeks. They are very short and do not sound like a word. Is this a stim or a precursor to practicing words? First of all, I do want to remind everyone, I'm a mom too. I get it. It's a long 3 weeks. So it's not clear from the question whether or not this person is starting to get annoyed, but it does sound like it could be bothersome. So we'll talk about some ways to deal with it. As for the question, is it a stim or is it a precursor to using words? Well, generally for professionals have stopped using the word stim. Some people within the autism community, full disclosure, still do use it. But professionals tend to use the word stereotypy to describe any kind of repetitive ritualistic behavior, which, by the way, we all have. Like you notice on these videos, I'm a hair twirler, and I talk with my hands a lot. So there are certain repetitive ritualistic behaviors that everybody's got. Well, not everybody. Everybody has different ones, but we all have a little something. So the problem with the word stim is that it implies a function that we don't necessarily know that's there. So this question actually kind of highlights one of the issues with the word stim, which is you can call it a stim, but that might kind of lead you down the wrong path of understanding what this behavior is. So, so the question, is it a stim or is it a precursor to language? It's possible that a lot of vocalizations can actually be both. So what we call a stim, again, is this repetitive ritualistic behavior. And the reason that, professionals have started calling it something else is not just to make everybody's lives more difficult because we don't know what professionals are talking about. I'm kidding. Not at all for that. But because we want some more clarity in what it is that we're talking about. So is this a repetitive ritualistic behavior? So let's use the word stereotypy and replace that with stim. Is this a repetitive ritualistic behavior that is typical of a diagnosis with autism spectrum disorder? And again, it's not a matter of those behaviors existing. It's a matter of degree, right? It's that it tends to be more pronounced in someone with autism spectrum disorder, not that it tends to only exist with that population. It's possible that this may be some form of repetitive ritualistic behavior. And now let's address what stim could actually mean is the reinforcer something that, rather than being socially mediated, so it's something that connects us to other people, we're trying to get somebody's attention, or we're trying to go away from social situations, that it has its own inherent value, that there's that these high-pitched screams are no different than for example, me watching television shows that my husband doesn't like after he goes to bed and the kids are in bed and I'm by myself. So it's not social in nature. The reinforcer is different than that. So it's hard to say whether this is, I think the question that you're asking is this something that is a social behavior or could be shaped into a social behavior, or is it something that's just, that, not just, I shouldn't say just, because as I like to say, just is a 4-letter word. Or is this something that instead is maintained by reinforcers other than those that are social? So it's maintained by reinforcers. Maybe it's the sound, maybe it's the feeling of making this noise, but its reinforcer is more similar to singing in the shower than it is speaking to others. So it's difficult to say without knowing what happens before the behavior and after the behavior. So if you look at the situations in which the behavior tends to occur, is it when your child is happily playing alone? Is it when your child, when something occurs that is more social, either something pleasant or unpleasant? Does it happen only in social contexts? So looking carefully at what's happening before the behavior and after the behavior can help you kind of answer the question about what's the purpose to this behavior. Even if it does have some sort of automatic reinforcement, which is when the reinforcer is not social in nature, either trying to move toward social contact or trying to move away from social contact, then there's still a possibility that it could be shaped. It's wonderful to see kids vocalize, and when you have sort of sounds coming out, then you know that there is the system is working, so to speak, that the mechanism of speech and the and that's all kind of in working order, and you have something. Once you have a behavior, no matter what the function of that behavior, you know you have something to shape. So it is very promising. I have worked with kids where it was really challenging, where they just kind of didn't really know how to get the words out. And it's a very powerful experience to try and teach somebody to make vocalizations when they don't really know how to do it. You really realize how very, very complicated it is. It has to be really well coordinated. You have to breathe in at the right time. You have to breathe out at the right time while your mouth is in the right position. And trying to assist somebody to coordinate all those moving parts is really eye-opening about how complex the whole system is. So this is, it's still really promising, even if the reinforcer is more automatic. So this parent didn't ask what to do, but I am going to address it anyway, because I've already had a few sips of coffee and I'm well on my way to fully caffeinated. So, so there are a couple of things to remember. Let's say that because let's take that it is, let's say that just for the sake of argument, that you're watching kind of what's going on with the behavior, and you see it happens a lot when he's kind of alone and playing contentedly. So he doesn't seem to be looking for anything in particular. Or it's happening in a lot of different contexts, so there doesn't seem to be any consistency. And you determine, like, from seeing that, that you think it probably is maintained by automatic reinforcement, or it's not, doesn't seem to be social. It seems to be that the reinforcer is something independent of social mediation, is kind of the fancy terminology for it, meaning that if that social interaction is kind of irrelevant to what keeps this behavior going. So you can praise me and you can ignore me eating ice cream. That's not why I eat ice cream. I eat ice cream because it tastes good. Actually, right now I try not to eat too much ice cream, but I long for it. So I eat ice cream because it tastes good, not because anybody says, "Oh man, good job eating ice cream." Although I do a very good job eating ice cream. So, so you determine from looking at that it does seem to be maintained by reinforcers that are not social. So let's move forward with that assumption. So there is a procedure that you could use. And some of the way that this is termed is the transfer of stimulus control. I like to give parents the kind of fancy terminology for stuff. And because I feel like it sort of makes it feel more official. Then you feel like, okay, I'm not, just playing, although I just said that. Well, I can say just when I say I just said. But I said earlier the word just is a 4-letter word because playing is important. Playing is a wonderful and valuable thing to do. So we don't diminish it by saying just. We embrace it by saying, I am playing with my child. Um, but you feel like you're a little bit more focused if you kind of understand how this works. And this process is done naturally by parents pretty often. But now I'm going to tell you what it is and why it works. So when your child engages in these vocalizations, one thing, or in some kind of vocalizations, maybe not these ones specifically, but one thing that you might try is to make it a little bit more interactive by repeating what he's doing and seeing how he reacts. So I worked with, they were different vocalizations. So the high pitch and the screaming might not be the best example, but I worked with a little boy who would go like, ba, 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 ba. I think that was it, but it was close enough. And then when he did that, I would repeat ba, 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 ba. And we did that for 3 exchanges. So he did it, then I did it. Then he did it, then I did it. And he did it, then I did it. And then I would try saying ba, 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 and see if he would repeat me. So, and what that does, it by sort of starting off by responding to the stimulus that he's presenting, to use a lot of fancy terminology, by starting off responding to the stimulus that he's presenting and then switching it, I transferred stimulus control from his vocalizations to my vocalizations, and then that put me in a better position for teaching. And that's called a transfer of stimulus control procedure. So you can try that a few times and see if you can get him to first repeat what he's recently said, and then see if you can get him to repeat other things. So that's one way to work with vocal stereotypy, with any kind of vocalization that is repetitive and ritualistic in nature and seems to be maintained by reinforcers that are independent of social mediation. So that's there's no social middleman. There's nothing going on social. So trying to work with vocalizations that way may help to shape the vocalization into something that is more universally understood. And I want to talk for a minute about, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I want to talk about stereotypy in general. And so I mentioned earlier that the autism community, the autism self-advocacy community, which is, 9 times out of 10, that's who I'm referring to when I say the autism community, is the group of self-advocates. They are it's interesting, and it puts me in kind of an awkward position as somebody who really believes in the dignity of individuals with autism, but is also a behavior analyst. There's a lot of misunderstanding based on bad behavior analysis. And so it's not really a misunderstanding, it's more of a trauma. And so people talk about how individuals with autism should not be stopped from engaging in stereotypy, that it's comforting, and they should, and people shouldn't be trying to stop people from engaging in behavior just because it makes them uncomfortable to watch, or the feeling is that it's stigmatizing to stop someone from engaging in stereotypy, which I agree, and that's why I haven't really done it. So it raises the issue of when to treat behavior. So the function of behavior is not a reason to treat. There are some very good reasons to treat behavior. If the behavior is dangerous, then absolutely, it's dangerous to the individual themselves or to someone else, then that should be treated. If the behavior is going to interfere with socialization, then that behavior really should be treated. If the behavior is interfering with instruction, then it should be treated enough so that the individual is able to gain from instruction. Like, you don't necessarily have to like eliminate it entirely, but just enough so that, or reduce it enough so that the individual can, engage in learning opportunities. As an example of that last one, I'm smiling, remembering all the fun times I had with this kid. I may have told this story already in another Coffee with Anne, but I'm going to tell it again anyway because I love it. There was one kid that I worked with in New York City, and in New York City, one of the restricted interests that's very common among kids with autism is the New York City subway system. For those of you who have never been to New York, the subway system pretty much has everything. It's a really complicated system, and it's got letters and numbers and colors and a lot of like kind of the pre-academic stuff that tends to be areas where kids with autism spectrum disorder really succeed and like really excel, actually. And it's got it's like the sort of the visual spatial aspects of the subway are really great, and it stays the same for years at a time. So so you can kind of see why it's such a common focused interest of kids with autism. So I worked with one kid who, if you let him, he would talk about the subway 24/7. And I had 2-hour sessions with him, and there were certainly some sessions where from the beginning to the end, we talked about nothing but the subway system. And now it's a really common topic of conversation in New York City. In fact, we did a little sort of long-term project where he planned a party and he invited all of his relatives. And as the party was wrapping up, his relatives, like his grandmother and his uncle, and they were all kind of standing around there, talking about it being about to leave. And they said, "Oh, like, how are we getting home?" "I don't know. I think I'll ask Jimmy." Like, Jimmy's a 6-year-old kid. You're going to ask him for directions home? But he knew he was the perfect person to ask for directions, because it was a real so this is not something that there's any reason to squash, really. But the mom actually put it really well. She said, we should be as tolerant as fairly tolerant kid, because if we're going to help him socially, we need to make sure that he can succeed socially. And not that many kids want to talk about, some do. And when I say some neurotypical kids really would be delighted to be talking about the subway for 2-hour stretches, but not everybody. So I wanted to make sure that he could talk about other things. So what I did was, at the beginning of the session, and at that time I did home services for kids with autism, and in New York City, like driving a car from place to place is actually kind of annoying. So I took the subway everywhere. And so at the beginning of the session, we would talk about all the trains that I took, and then we were done until the end of the session, when I talked about all the trains I was going to take for the rest of the day. And in between, if he brought up the subway system, I would say, okay, we're not talking about that. We're talking about whatever we're doing. So the idea was not to eliminate it. The idea was to just reduce it, make sure he could talk about other stuff. And now he can't. Now he's a teenager, and he talks about politics and girls and his job and his school and all sorts of other things. He still talks about the subway because he loves the subway, and that's great. So, in the beginning, it interfered with socialization, and it interfered with instruction a little bit. So we treated it, but we didn't treat it to get rid of it. We treated it to just manage it. Like, just, it's great that you want to talk about the subways, but let's also be able to talk about other things. Let's not make that interest so much that it pushes other things out of the way. I'm not interested in, shoving it in a closet and locking the door. I'm interested in opening another door, So, the bottom line for me personally as a professional, which is of course a very different position, for me, the bottom line in deciding whether or not to treat a behavior is, what can it do for a kid? And so you want to you really want to have some honest conversation, like an honest look at the behavior. And this is something that, your therapist can help you kind of peel apart, and I can certainly help you peel apart. And but you want to have a really honest conversation with yourself about whether this behavior serves this kid. I remember once when I was working in a school that there was an assistant teacher there, and she worked with a child who she absolutely adored him. And they were very, very, very close. And to a point where things like what I'm about to say would happen. And one day she was absent, and someone said, "Oh yeah, well that kid bit her and she had to go to the doctor and get antibiotics." And so I was like, okay, that's new. And so the next day, I kind of called her into my office, and it was never like a mean thing when I was calling people into my office. I'm not very good at being mean. So I would call her I called her into my office, and I said, "Glad to have you back. Yeah, everything okay?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "So he bit you?" And she said, "Oh yeah." And I said, has this happened before?" And she said, "Yeah, but it's not that big a deal." And I said, "I understand what you mean. What you mean is you're not offended, and you still love him to death, and you still really want to work with him, and you're not angry, and which is all wonderful. But it's important to remember that that behavior should still be treated. It's not about whether or not the behavior bothers you. It's about whether or not the behavior serves him." And my bottom line is I want every kid I work with to get invited to a ton of birthday parties. That to me, and if there's a behavior that's interfering with that's where I treat. And it's not about I want to get rid of this behavior because it annoys me. It's about I want to get rid of this behavior because it doesn't serve them. Now, as a parent, that's my point of view as a professional. As a parent, your social environment is your home. So if the behavior is driving you crazy, then that is impeding socialization, because the social environment is the home. If you find yourself turning down invitations, or not inviting people over, or stopping doing things that bring you joy in your own home, then it's time to resolve the issue. Sometimes this happens so slowly that you don't really notice it, which is why it's important to have these kind of check-ins to think about, whether this is serving you anymore. And if there's something that has been going on for a while, and in the beginning it seemed okay, and now it's not okay, you have my permission to try and change it. And, we can all help you to try and do that. Growing up is about rules changing. You don't have to have all the rules the same from the time that you're a baby until the time that you're an adult. I remember I had a supervisor once. There was a kid who was, fairly little, and he used a bottle for nap time, and the parents were not ready to take that away. And so he was being monitored by a pediatrician. His teeth were fine, and there were like a lot of reasons why I didn't feel like it was something I wanted to push. And my supervisor at the time said, "Well, he'll have to give it up eventually." And my response was, "Well, he'll have to pay rent eventually. Should he get a job now? He's 2." So, you might be ready for it. Now might be the time to work on certain things. And if you decide that it isn't, that's okay. And if you decide that it wasn't before and it is now, that's okay too. So it's a very long and complicated. I answered like 5 questions and I only got one. But I hope that gives you kind of a sort of like a way to approach these sort of things. So to wrap up, and question number 1 was, is it something that's moving toward language, or is it something that is like maintained kind of without any sort of social mediation? And the answer to that is, I'm not really sure. It depends on what's happening before the behavior and what's happening after the behavior. That's what we look for to figure that out. And when we look at that, we're really developing a hypothesis about it. Like we don't necessarily know for sure, but we can take an educated guess based on those factors. And the second question that I'm kind of jumping to, since we're talking about this, is, is it something that should be reduced? And I'm saying, that really depends on how much it's interfering with other stuff. And the third question is, okay, well then what do we do about it? And one thing we might try is a transfer of stimulus control procedure, or trying to shape it so that it's, if we do want to reduce it or shape it, trying to turn it into something that is, if it's bothersome, that make a little less bothersome, which might mean quieter. It might mean more clear, because the biggest thing you want from language is for it to be universally understood. It's not a problem that babies cry. It's not a problem. Like if my plants would cry, I would water them and I wouldn't have dead plants in my house. Like it's not a problem that babies cry. It's an evolutionary advantage. But if I walk into a pizza place and cry, they're not going to know what I want. So, okay, we have a couple more. Okay, so we have a comment here. My son has a terrible time with keeping the volume down on his iPad. Every day we are asking him to turn down the iPad. It drives us crazy. We've used volume sanity, but he knows how to override it. Kids and technology, when they outsmart you, it's very difficult. Do you know of any other app that works in controlling volume on the iPad that we could try? I don't, actually. I think that, sometimes, first of all, I want to say good on you, because this, using a technology issue for a technology problem can be really helpful. And I think that's probably, I don't know of any apps. I can look into that, but if you can try and, what I might look for in an app is something that sets the volume and also is protected by a password that you can create, because that is harder to guess. You can usually kind of figure out an app just by tapping a bunch of stuff, but a password would be much more difficult to figure out on your own. I'm not sure of any apps, but I'll look into that. That's a tough one. Once he learns how to do that. And one thing I would not do, although it's probably really tempting, and it was the first thing that pops into my head, was use earphones. Because if he's turning up the volume really high, he might do that with the earphones, and that could, kind of damage his hearing over the long term. So as tempting as it might be, earphones might not be the best choice. I would also look at what's happening in the situation. Is he turning up the volume when people are talking and he's like trying to drown you out? Then, in that case, maybe noise reduction headphones would be a good point. He won't accept the headphones. Yeah. So there are a couple of questions in here, and one of them is, and I think that the way this parent has asked this question really highlights exactly what I was just talking about. So, and it's really interesting and really awesome how it wasn't, this parent is kind of choosing like, headphones are not the hill I want to die on. I want to make sure the volume stays down. So let me address it instead of like having a big fight about the volume. Let me address it in this technology way. And which I think is really interesting and yay, because I think it's the simplest solution is to try and find some way to address the technology rather than putting him through a whole teaching procedure that might absorb a lot of time and a lot of mental energy and aggravation. So my mother used to say, she doesn't say it as much. She's still alive. She's retired, so she doesn't say this as much. But she'd say you could pay in money or you could pay in aggravation. And in this case, you're really paying exclusively in aggravation and time. So that is something that you really want to spend wisely. And I always tell my kids, I tell them mostly when we're running late someplace or when we can't do something that they really wanted to do, I tell them time is a finite resource. And so spending a lot of time on teaching something that, just so they can have the volume down when there's another simple solution, that's, it's a finite resource and it's very, very valuable. So yeah, I don't know of any apps offhand. I'll look into that though. And sorry, I didn't have a really good answer to that one, but I loved the question. So that's what makes me even more brokenhearted that I didn't have a decent answer. Okay, we have another chat about it. We thought about that. He won't accept. We've tried the behavioral approach, taking the iPad away, etc., but it doesn't change the behavior. I would definitely look at what seems to be happening before the volume goes up, and see if there's a way that you can make the environment a little bit more amenable to listening. If it's something like you're trying to like if it goes up as soon as you talk to your husband, or if it goes up, as soon as something else happens, or if it goes up like 5 or 10 minutes into using the iPad. Just to eliminate other possibilities, I might have his hearing tested just to make sure. Just to make 100% sure that we're looking at all the possibilities. It sounds to me like, if this is the only symptom, it sounds to me like probably his hearing is fine, but I would just rule it out. Like, see if you can get his hearing tested, just to rule it out. You're welcome for the thumbs up tech approach. Like, if I didn't feel like I had to hold my microphone, I would take off my shoes and give you my big toes up too. The last question for today, and is my son has no interest in self-dressing, even with visual pics. How can I make him more interested? This is a complicated thing. Now, a lot of kids have like a sort of a drive for independence. It's very common that kids have this drive for independence. And that's when one source of the expression, the terrible twos, I don't know if that's an expression in the Netherlands, but in the US, there's an expression which is the terrible twos. And because 2-year-olds are, typically developing 2-year-olds, all that progress kind of converges at the same time. So they're able to move independently, they're able to communicate more or less, and they have some motor skills to do things that have been done for them up until this point. So I know that my son will literally have a thermonuclear tantrum if you don't let him put his shoes on by himself, which is frustrating as a parent, because it's like where you have to get out the door, come on, just put your shoes on. And he takes his 2-year-old time, and he doesn't do it as efficiently as I do. So that drive for independence is is typical. If that's not there, it is it does present a challenge, because to some extent, the system isn't Like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like, it's working fine to have you put my shoes on. So here's my foot. Like, why should I get dressed? So self-dressing is a little bit tricky. What I might do is something that, again, I'm going to give you the fancy terminology. Something that's called a backward chaining procedure in a bit of a, casual way. So what I might do in a backward chaining procedure. So when you have a bunch of responses that are, when all put together, make one process. So that's called a behavior chain. And you know that something's really a behavior chain when you kind of start it and then just kind of go to the finish. I remember I made cake balls once for my daughter's birthday, and a friend of mine was like, wow, how'd you do this? And I said, oh, it's super easy. First you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this. And her eyes started to glass over. She was like, I have no idea. This is a lot of work. But like, it's that kind of thing where it's just kind of, when you say, oh, it's so easy to do this, you do this, 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 this. That is a behavior chain when you kind of go very naturally to the end once you get to the start. So a lot of things like self-dressing, like self-feeding, are behavior chains for us. So we don't think about all of the steps that go into that. When you're teaching a behavior chain, so when I get dressed, it actually involves a lot of different behaviors. So yeah, in my case, I go to the drawer, I pick out something to wear. First I put on my underwear, and then I put on this, and then I put on that, and each of those things involves a lot of steps. So putting on my pants involves holding the waistband, putting one foot in, putting the other foot in, pulling them up to my knees, then pulling them up to my waist. And all those steps are things that I don't think about. The only thing, so I feel like it's a one-step procedure, get dressed, when really it's many, 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 many steps. So one of the keys to teaching something to become a behavior chain, so that we can eventually just say, like, okay, get dressed, and then all of those steps happen, is understanding what all those steps are. And that's what we call a task analysis. So what we're analyzing is all of the steps that have to go into completing that task. So a task analysis is when we take a close look at or analyze all of the steps that go into completing something you have to do. So a task, and I'm going to take pants just as an example. So the task analysis of putting on pants is grasping the waistband. This is the task analysis that I've used. And they're kind of individual. Like, certain kids will need more steps in some places and fewer steps in other places. Grasping the waistband, putting one foot in. I usually start with the right foot. Putting the left foot in, pulling the waistband up to the knees. At that point, if you can, meaning if the pants are at your ankles, like, don't trip, standing up, pulling up to, usually mid-thigh I have as the next step. And then, because it's a slightly different motion, I differentiate the last step of pulling it up over your tush to the waist. So one thing that you can try doing is, first of all, have an understanding of all of the steps. And this is something that, that Kelly's brilliant at. So she can help you out, like, figuring out all the steps. So figure out all of the steps and try and present this the same way whenever you do it. So whenever you do the teaching. Okay, we're going to talk about the difference between teaching and, like, getting through the day in a second. So whenever you decide to teach it, present it in the same way. So say the same things, have the same if you usually give them the pants, if you usually have them pick the pants up off the bed. But present it the same way every time. Guide them through the first several steps, as you usually do, like help them get dressed. And then at the last step, stop and allow them to finish up. For self-dressing, well, what's the reinforcer for dressing ourselves? It's being dressed, right? So like for most of us, we're like, oh, now I'm dressed. Now I can, go to the coffee shop and talk to everyone in the day, or, whatever it is. So, now I'm dressed. Now I can move on to the next part of my day. That's the reinforcer for most of us to get dressed. So that's what so the advantage of the backward chaining procedure in terms of to use for dressing is that it's the last step, the part where you're actually dressed, that leads to a reinforcer. So I would, so whenever you feel like it's a teaching day, I would present it the same way, and I would stop at the last step, which for pants, I would recommend pulling them up to the waistband, like from like mid-thigh. For getting in a shirt is a little more complicated. There are a lot of steps that involve a lot of coordination. So people tend to have a different task. Like there are a surprising number of different task analyses for putting a shirt on. So pick the way that you feel works the best for your child. So the last step might be putting the last arm in the sleeve. That would probably be the task analysis that I would use. But the only right way to put on a shirt is the way that ends up with a shirt on. So there's no value judgment in what kind of task analysis that you use. So that would be where I would start. And I would also do it when there's something reinforcing happening afterwards, or when or for a kid who really needs that kind of immediacy, where the reinforcer is available as soon as the pants hit the waist. There's a reinforcer delivered. Now, those of you who've met with me before know that that I usually say to parents to really decide the times that you're teaching and that you're not teaching. And I say that because, when I work with a kid in their home, I have one thing to do, and that is work with that kid. I don't have to answer the phone. I don't have to pay the bills. I don't have to cook dinner. I don't have to do anything except work with that kid. That's it. So my level of focus is very differently. When I'm home, I'm still the same person. And by the way, I'm still a behavior analyst. Like, behavior analysis is not what I do. It's who I am. I'm still a behavior analyst when I'm home. But when I'm home, my level of focus is different. I don't necessarily have the same level of focus, because when I'm home and I'm getting my kids dressed, we got to get out the door. We've got a train to catch usually. And so I do it very differently. And that's okay. Sometimes it's a teaching time, and sometimes it's, we got to go. So the first step is give yourself permission to have teaching days and non-teaching days. And the second step is see how you can differentiate the teaching days from the non-teaching days. So there's a concept called conditional discrimination, which means basically that you have I'll explain the way it is in an operant chamber, and then I'll explain the way it is for regular people. So so B.F. Skinner looked at conditional discrimination, and so he had a pigeon in a cage. So a lot of stuff with pigeons. So the pigeon in a cage, and when the light was on, if the pigeon pecked the key, then there would be saccharine water delivered. That's what the if you're curious, that's what the reinforcer was like 9 times out of 10 in these little experiments. Just like, saccharine water, like Kool-Aid or Diet Coke or whatever. So when the light was on, the pigeon could peck and receive a reinforcer, which is like this delicious little sweet thing. If the light wasn't on, if the pigeon pecked, then nothing would happen. So so the pigeon learns pretty quickly to only peck when the light's on, because pecking when the light's not on is like, why? It's pointless. Like, you're not going to get anything out of it. So so what we do, one thing that we could do is, if we're deciding ahead of time that this is a teaching day and this is a non-teaching day, one thing that makes it a little bit easier is to figure out a way to communicate that to the kid. So making sure that there are enough stimulus conditions to say, like, now the expectation is that you dress yourself, or now the expectation is, I'm just going to dress you and it's okay. So there are a number of ways that you could do this. This is a little, this is a bit of a mommy confession, I'll tell you. But now my son sleeps in the top bunk, so I can't really do this anymore. But for a very long time, and I'm talking about like kindergarten, first grade, he was such a sound sleeper in the morning that I would get him dressed when he was still asleep. So, even just like, like while they're still lying down, start getting them dressed. And that may be enough, like, stimulus conditions. That's but see if there's something that you could do to have, and it doesn't have to be like a terrifically meaningful stimulus, just something that signals this is a teaching day and this is a non-teaching day. Like, even having the lights on in the room versus the lights off in the room. How you start the dressing. Are you starting the dressing when they're lying down and you're just like, keep them lying down, or do you have everybody sitting up before you start? Which would be what you would do for a teaching day. So, see what you could do to communicate that difference. I'm a big fan of conditional discrimination. In fact, I have a bit of a bugaboo about, this is the problem when you are a behavior analyst and also kind of a nerd, when people talk about sleep training as being extinction. I make a big stink about that, and I say, no. Extinction is a totally different process. And sleep training is conditional discrimination. You're not teaching kids that you're never going to come to them when they cry and they have to sleep 24 hours a day. You're teaching them that at this time, it's time to sleep, which is a very different thing to teach them. So conditional discrimination is a really big deal. And that can kind of help you to differentiate the teaching days from the non-teaching days. I'm a big believer in deciding ahead of time what's going to be a teaching day and what isn't. And I'm a big believer in having non-teaching days. Because as I say to parents all the time, I would rather you have a really focused and reinforcing 5 minutes than a really exhausting and unsuccessful 6 hours. And this is, there are a lot of behavior analysts around who will tell you, like, more is better, be 100% consistent 24 hours a day. And that has its value. But, and that's, like, as much practice as you can get is good. But the quality of that practice in terms of keeping you going is a really big factor. Applied behavior analysis is not the science of working with kids with autism and doing discrete trial teaching. It isn't. It is the science of how every organism learns. And I'm an organism, you're an organism, your kid is an organism. This is how we all learn. So if we're going to say, your child needs reinforcers to help them learn, guess what? You need reinforcers to help you learn. Making this exhausting and aversive for yourself You don't get a prize for suffering the most. Your prize is seeing how your kid makes progress. And I'm willing to give you a prize too. But but really the best, thanks, Anne, whatever. Really the best prize is seeing how much progress your kid makes. So, and you get that whether you are a little inconvenienced or really, really suffering. So go for a little inconvenienced. So some other examples of ways that you can use conditional discrimination to differentiate between teaching days and non-teaching days. I have been asked before, I don't know if this is a thing in the Netherlands, but it's kind of a thing in the US, so I'm going to describe it anyway. There are those backpacks that there's someone chatting with me in the chat window, which is making me smile. So you can tell me if this is a thing in the Netherlands. There are these like little backpacks, and usually they have animals on them, and they have a long sort of string that's like a leash to keep kids from running off. Is that a thing? It's a thing here. And I've been asked how I feel about them. Especially for, no, not really. Okay, yeah. And the other weird thing is one time I was at the zoo and I saw a kid wearing one of those backpacks and I saw a dog in a stroller. And I was like, this is a weird switcheroo. But I've been asked how I feel about those. And it's not an option here. Okay. So whatever you have to do to get through the non-teaching days is okay. So there's no cheating, there's no lazy, there's no damage. So I've been asked how I feel about them. I'm going to finish my story anyway. I've been asked how I feel about them. And I said, well, what I really don't like about them is that they don't teach anything. But if you're doing teaching days where you don't have to worry about your kid running into traffic, and you can preserve safeties, then go ahead, because we're solving the problem of that not teaching anything. So if you go to the grocery store and instead of having them working with them on calmly walking down the aisles, you just kind of put them in the cart and go, that's fine. Sometimes you have to just buy groceries. And so whatever you have to do to get through those, not get through, you should, of course you should have as much joy in your life as possible, but whatever you have to do on the non-teaching days is okay, so long as you have the teaching days, and so long as you have a way, something that the kid can kind of latch onto to say, oh, it's a teaching day. Okay, great. So we're going to work on holding hands and walking down the aisle of the store without touching anything. Versus, oh, I guess everybody's going to kick back and mom's not going to be as consistent. Okay. Because there are times when you can have 100% consistency and there are times when you can't. If you're working on, and I've worked on this with kids, if you're working on walking up and down the aisles of a grocery store without, knocking down all the cereal boxes or something, that's really hard to do if you actually have to buy cereal or, God forbid, eggs. You'll end up with 24 broken eggs. So, sometimes you have to kind of get from point A to point B, and that's okay. Again, when I work with kids in their homes, I don't live there. I have a very different role. And so, the thing that makes it a little bit easier, again, is just figuring out a way to signal to your child, a nonverbal cue is better. Hey, this is, now, I know I do this most of the time. Today is the day when you do it. Okay, so those are our questions for the day. And we've still got 5 minutes. So are there any others? No? Okay. So this was a really meaty coffee with Anne. And look how little caffeine I've had. It's you guys just perked me right up, and who needs it? So I guess to sum up what we've been talking about today, uh, there are things that, first of all, one thing to think about when you're looking at a behavior is, why is this individual doing it, is a really common question. And there are, sleeping is an issue. Let's have a whole coffee with Anne to talk about sleep. Ironically, it's only 7:30 a.m. here, so I'll talk about sleep as as an outside expert. Haha. No, I'm kidding. No, I got plenty of sleep last night. Well, not plenty, but it was my choice. Let's talk sleep in June. What do you say? And Catherine, I think that we're gonna. I have a couple of dates that will work for June. It'll be sleep. But to wrap up what we were talking about today, looking at a behavior in terms of why it's occurring, one way to do that is to look at what's happening before and after. Behaviors don't need to be treated based on why they're occurring. They need to be treated based on whether or not they're serving this child, and in some cases, whether or not they're serving this child anymore. And the things that you treat, those are, make sure that you have an idea in your head of the times that you're teaching and the times that you're and the times that you're being a family and spending time together without that context. And try and figure out a way to show your child which is which. Okay. All right. Thank you guys so much. And I look forward to our next sleep-focused Coffee with Anne. No, you rock. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.